Well, hello, everybody. I'm Jeromey Martini, president at Horizon College and Seminary, and we are here for our third video related to our reconciliation, work on reconciliation with our Indigenous peoples following the ongoing discoveries of children and bodies at residential schools that kicked us off. But really, it's a bigger discussion. That's just sort of been a flashpoint, not just for us, but for Canadians in general, for a bigger conversation. And we are really grateful as we have this conversation to have with us Andrew and Jimmy Thunder, both brothers, both alumni of our school here, but both committed Christians working in the area of reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous. And Andrew and Jimmy both graduated from here, went on, worked with to earn MBAs. So have both those perspectives to bring as well on this question. Andrew is the director of corporate responsibility at the Northwest Company, which is the largest employer of Indigenous peoples in Canada. There's a lot of work, particularly with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, bringing that to bear on his work, and also works up in the north as well. Jimmy, Director of Economic Development at Norway House First Nations, and also founder of Reconciliation Thunder, a nonprofit organization that works with Indigenous and non-Indigenous relations, and adjunct faculty here at Horizon, where he teaches our Indigenous ministry to our students, and hopefully we're seeing as part of which is one of the things of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. One of the suggestions is to do this sort of education. So we're grateful to have Jimmy helping us there. This is our third video, so we do welcome you to go back and look at the previous two videos that we've made and some blogs as well. And we're engaging with this question of really, we're working with those people who are curious to know, how is it that I relate to, how do I respond to some of the tragedies that come to light? And we've given some suggestions. Jimmy and Andrew have given some suggestions, lots of resources. There are tons of resources out there in terms of the 94 calls to action, Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and other resources. And we're going to zero in on some of that today. But to start with, maybe we can just hear a little bit, Andrew and Jimmy. Let's get to know you. We're three videos deep now, but we could get to know you guys a little bit better. Maybe your own spiritual journey, some of your own history and story that you can start off sharing with us.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess we'll start by saying that we're from Sachigo Lake First Nation. To introduce ourselves in our language, we would say Jimmy Nindishinakaz Sachigo Lake Nindunji. Just means my name is Jimmy. I'm from Sachigo Lake. A lot of times when we introduce ourselves as First Nations people, it's not where you work or what you do, it's where you're from and who's your family and that kind of a thing. And so introducing ourselves that way today, and we're talking about where we're from. So Sachigo Lake First Nation, it's in northwestern Ontario, and what we see here today, this is our family. So on the far left, you can see our father, Max Thunder, and he was a pastor and a minister for a good part of his life. Since he was maybe 14, 15 years old is when he became a Christian, became a pastor of a small church in Patricia Point when he was 16, and just been traveling and preaching and serving in multiple different capacities, since then. And to his right is Gilbert Thunder. So that's his father. This is our grandfather. He's holding my sister Amanda in this photo. He's also a believer. He's also a Christian. And it was really important that his family continue to go to church every Sunday. And a lot of the values that we have, it's because our dad said that grandpa said, or his dad said. And so there's been a lot of passing down of values and statements He spoke, he didn't speak English very well. It's very few. He said he knew the word Sachigo tomorrow, and which he said quite frequently. And I think Andrew knew the word, do you eat fish, which he also used frequently. But other than that, it was a lot of the communication came through our father. And but a lot of values, a lot of those strong teachings were passed down to us. To his right is that's Jimmy Thunder. That's who I'm named after. And so he was also a believer, and he was of the Anglican Church. And so again, really important for him to make sure that his family went to church every single Sunday, no matter what the weather. They would show up. To him, his prayer book was really important to him. So we always had that, and just having that good sense of love for each other, taking care of the family, leading the family, working hard for the family, and again passing values down to his family. Now to his right is Andrew Thunder, and that's where Andrew gets his name. So that's so this is a father and son photo here. So Jimmy Thunder was the father of Andrew Thunder, and Andrew Thunder and Gilbert Thunder were brothers. And same thing, another believer, and by choice. And so yeah, so this is some of the members of our family. And just and one thing that we want to highlight is it's by choice. They all chose to be Christians, and I think that's something that we really want to highlight here in this video. Christianity first came to Sachigo First Nation by an Anglican minister that we only know today as Mr. Garnet, and we assume that his name probably was Mr. Garnet, but it exists. The name exists in Sachigo memory as Mr. Garnet. And we had other ministers. John Spellner came and in his bush plane and introduced Pentecostal denomination and faith to us. And yeah, so that's our story. I don't know if Andrew would add anything.
Oh yeah, it's really important as we look back at our history and our father, grandfather, our grandparents, and really the theme throughout all of our upbringings was the importance of faith, the importance of the Christian faith, and making that central to all the decisions that we make. And it's central to it's a central guide to our lives, right? And as James had mentioned, from one generation to the next, the most important thing for each of the family members and what was instilled from one generation to the next was the importance of going to church and making sure that their faith guided the lives of each person. So, and so my memories with my father and my, as James had mentioned, very often they would quote their grandparents, right? And so you would see faith getting passed on from one generation to the next, and every single time. So there was no their faith journey did not include at any point imposing the Christian faith on any of them, but they had the choice, and they made the conscious decision to choose to follow Christ and to make Christianity their the key aspect to their life. And so we're the next generation off of this picture, and we also have another generation coming up with. I have two sons as well, and my uncle very often jokingly says that he's going to be a preacher one day as well. So we're just very happy. We look at this image and we're just we appreciate the fact that God has been with us from one generation all the way back, several generations back. So.
It's amazing. And your uncle too, I think he's a fiery evangelist, is he not?
Yep. Some people would even refer to him as the Billy Graham of the North. Like he is very active in terms of spreading the gospel up north, and he holds conferences twice a year with people from all different First Nations throughout Canada who attend, and the impacts are phenomenal. But he would always attribute his faith, the impact of his ministry to his father, Gilbert Thunder, the second person in this photo.
Amazing.
And one thing I want to do as well too, I just want to acknowledge the women in our family as well. We're all men here talking today, and these are all men in the photos, but well, with the exception of Amanda there, but just really acknowledging the women as well, and we're using this just as an introduction of our family, and mostly because we're explaining where our names come from and that kind of a thing, but also acknowledging the women and the leadership and the great work and that they're doing as well. And I think that in Indigenous cultures, that balance is very important. The other thing that I want to talk about is so none of these men went to residential schools, but in our family, two of our uncles did. And so the story there and the experience with Christian faith is different. When you have the choice imposed upon you to go to a residential school, and we didn't find out until late in our life that they went, and it's very, very difficult to share about those memories and those experiences, and to recognize that even though still as believers, they carry a lot of those memories even until today, and it has infected their life and that kind of a thing. So there's a wound that exists, and we also want to acknowledge that as part of this story as well.
We should also mention as well that our father did not attend a residential school, but he did attend a day school several years of his education as well. And so for those of you who don't know, day schools were very similar to residential schools. They were taught the same types of curriculum, but they were allowed to go home in the evening and attend school during the day. And so he did express some of his experiences with us, he went through very traumatic things similar to what residential school survivors had shared. But for him, he was able to, the remarkable thing is he's able to retain his faith and continue to pass on his faith to his family, even with that experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's true. And again, this is force, like these are threats to be arrested if you don't attend these schools. So I think that's important to mention as well.
Yeah, no, that's an amazing legacy, and so important to share and to get to know you guys better and to understand where you've come from, and that history is so important. The history shapes us, right? We just can't absent ourselves from our own histories personally, and we can't just absent ourselves from the history of even in our countries and things like that, which is so much of the discussion right now with what's going on. It didn't just emerge out of nowhere. It's we are the products of our past, and that's an important reminder as we continue in this discussion. And even today, kind of linking this stuff together, we've looked at some of these different aspects and the different stories that have come out. Our last video, we looked at the 94 calls to action and saw how, in fact, those flowed out of much larger studies and mass volumes, and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and that they had produced. And we want to just drill down a little bit today at just a few of those ones that relate specifically to the faith or specifically to the church. And we're even zeroing in. There are some calls that are specific to, say, the Catholic Church, and calls, say, to the Pope or whatever. Most of our audience here would say, well, that's not us. We're different. But there's some calls here that relate to the broader faith community as well. And so we want to just take a look at some of those and come at it with, how do these calls relate? How do these 94 calls, how does the Truth and Reconciliation Commission relate to my faith as a we call ourselves probably from the free church tradition, right? Not a mainline church, we're free church traditions, Pentecostal or Alliance or Baptist or different ones like that. How do these relate to us? And so we've selected a few to zero in on, haven't we? And maybe Jimmy, I think, or Andrew, are you gonna lead us off here? I think.
So the first one that we're going to read is, and again, we're reading directly from the Truth and Reconciliation Calls to Action. And within that, there are calls for individuals, institutions, and churches. And it's really a way for, the society, Canadian society in general, to respond to the research that's been done and to listen as a way to respond to the voices of Indigenous peoples. Right now, we're going to look at call to action number 49. And in here, I'm just going to read it right away here. It says, we call upon all religious denominations and faith groups who have not already done so to repudiate concepts used to justify European sovereignty over Indigenous lands and peoples, such as the doctrine of discovery and terra nullius. And so with this call to action, it's important for us to recognize, and as we're going through these calls to action, we have to look at this through the lens of an understanding of the history that has happened within this country, but specifically to Indigenous peoples, right? And in here, they're mentioning repudiating the doctrine of discovery and the doctrine of terra nullius. So as Christians, we need to understand how these doctrines, these that have been under the banner of the Christian faith, have been used in order to reinforce European sovereignty throughout history, but as well as what spawned from this oppressive acts of legislation, as well as various other means of oppressing Indigenous peoples.
Now you'll have to, I'm sure I'm not going to be the only one that's going to say, I have never heard of the doctrine of discovery and terra nullius. These are going to be new to many of us. So can you maybe let us know what these two things are?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's part of what the TRC had to do. Again, these are summaries, and there's huge concepts and huge history that are loaded into each of these calls. And so terra nullius, terra means land, and nullius means void or empty. So terra nullius means empty land, or the land is empty. And it's part of the doctrine of discovery. So essentially, the teaching of terra nullius says that if Indigenous people are not farming the land or using it for agriculture, then the land is empty because the Indigenous people could be seen as flora and fauna. They're essentially seen as animals that are moving about the land aimlessly. And so the land is free for your discovery. And so this terra nullius is part of the doctrine of discovery, came from the Catholic Church through something called papal bulls. And they're such bulls as Inter Cantera and Romanus Pontifex and that kind of thing. So it's this old church history. We're talking about 1500s, 1600s. And so that's why a lot of us have not heard of them. But this came from a time where the church and the state were really tightly woven together. And so state interest and church interest were melded. And so a lot of our problem comes from that melding, that the Christian identity is the same as the state identity. And so that's where this comes from. And so you might think, well, if it's so old that we don't know about it, that the majority of Christians don't know about it, well, why does it even matter? And so, well, it does matter because it's part of our, as Canadians, we may not know this, but it's been part of our case law for almost over 100 years. It entered our case law through a U.S. Supreme Court decision in 1823 with the U.S. Supreme Court Justice John Marshall in the Johnson versus McIntosh case. And it wasn't until 2014 in the Tsilcoton versus BC case that Canada finally acknowledged that, yeah, these two are not legal concepts that are recognized in Canada and doesn't have grounding in Canada. So imagine that, 1823 to 2014. So this matters. It came from the church. It matters. Things that are happening, even whether or not you know about it, it matters, and it has an effect on lived Indigenous experiences, whether you know it or not. And the thing about this call is that it says concepts, repudiating concepts such as the doctrine of discovery and terra nullius. So there's more. there's more that we need.
I mean, in essence, really, as I understand it, and you can correct me here, but as I understand, basically what it's saying is, this predates sort of Canada in the sense that these are just doctrines of you go to a new land, and if there are Indigenous people, there are peoples on this land, and they aren't utilizing the land. They don't recognize the value of the land in a sense. They aren't using it in a way that's making best use of the resources that are available on that land. You have divine right to take that land.
Yeah.
Is that a summary of?
Yep. That is a great summary. You know, it's basically it's a decree from God, you know, that God is giving you permission to own that land, you know, and it's worked our way into Canada's legal system for centuries.
Okay, so number 49 then is religious denominations to say, hey, we repudiate that. Now, I would think probably most of the ones that track with us would have a dissociation between church and state, in a sense that would say, yeah, no problem. Of course we should. No problem. We would repudiate that, right? Like we would think, but then if we're going to truly repudiate it, then we would have to say, look, no, there's no cause, there's no divine sanction. We don't recognize whatever this came from in the 1500s. We don't recognize this sanction as a divine right, that if somebody's not using the land, you know, I mean, I can't imagine my neighbor probably doesn't think I'm utilizing my backyard in the way that maybe they feel that I should, you know, so that there's a divine right to now take over my backyard space because I'm not using it appropriately or as they feel is best. I mean, that it really is almost, you know, that's silly. So it was a way to justify coming into a new territory and feeling justified in taking over that territory. So I would think that most of our type people would say, yeah, no problem. Of course we repudiate that. That's silly.
Yeah, exactly. And that's a really good analogy, you know, like, yeah, Jeremy's not taking care of his yard properly. I'm going to take it. That's my yard now, you know, like it's a good analogy. And so you would think like, yeah, like you would make the assumption, like just Indigenous peoples, like this seems like an easy one. It seems like an easy checkbox, you know, like if you just understood it, then sure. Yeah. Let's repudiate it. I think challenges are when you say, concepts used to justify European sovereignty, right? Because that there's this category we're building, and we're saying then such as, right? So, well, let's unpack this a little bit. What are these other things, you know, concepts used to justify European sovereignty? And so these are simple things such as, you know, like, well, we're assuming that we're all one in Christ, you know, like the one in Christ argument. I mean, sure we are. But if we're one in Christ, then does that mean that we need to, you know, forget, you know, the treaties and forget like the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples and that kind of a thing, you know? So things that like, if you don't know the whole picture and the whole background of our relationship together, then you will not see the connection between the two. You know, it seems like two entirely different things. And so just anything that can be used to justify European sovereignty over Indigenous lands and resources, we need to repudiate those things.
Right, and this is just really going back to history. Sorry, Andrew, you're going to say something. I've said enough.
Oh, I was just going to say, just for, you know, we also need to look at why is it even in this calls to action to begin with, and why would churches even need to repudiate this, right? And so we also have to have that appreciation of how some of these doctrines were used within our society, within Canada throughout the years. And it was largely used in the 1800s when there was a lot of European settlers that began to increase and even overpopulate, there was a larger population of European settlers versus Indigenous peoples that were originally here. And when that was being used, you know, they were looking for the lands that were rich in minerals and good for agriculture. And, a lot of these lands were given to the European settlers, right? And so, fast forward to 2021, and we're looking at the different different barriers that exist for Indigenous peoples and that have existed for Indigenous people, the condition of Indigenous peoples' economies. That has a real effect over the generations, right? Of
Right.
the different families that may not have had the same opportunities through the years, right? And so we need to understand that, and the fact that there is that connection within the history, and it had a real impact over the years.
Yeah, so the faith group's interest in this, in one sense, is really that Christianity or God has been used to justify actions, and we need to say, look, that's probably not okay. So
yeah, and then to simplify it even further, it's again going back to our family. We all chose Christianity, but there was nothing attached. As Christianity was presented to us, it's just Jesus, and that's it.
Right.
And that's what we want to do, is like none of these other concepts of like European sovereignty over our lands, like that wasn't part of the deal. But so just to make it extremely simple, like when we are accepting Christ, it's just Christ. We don't want to add anything into it. So remember, from this period of our history when there was the separation of church and state, like we want to keep that separate. And so there's a term called decolonizing our faith. And so that's people are like, whoa, like what is this word? I don't like it, but let's just unpack that a little bit. It's decolonizing. So it's just taking our faith back to what it was originally meant to be. When Jesus came to us and offered a relationship, he wasn't trying to get anything out of it. There wasn't anything attached. There's no strings attached. It's just, I want you for you. And that was it. So decolonizing is just going back to the relationship with Jesus and Jesus alone.
Yeah, and I mean that'll be a trigger word for some, because we got it used on by certain ideologies and left, but really it's just saying that point in history where faith language was merged together with state language and used for things, and we need to acknowledge and decouple that, because they were never meant to be coupled. The one leading into this 48 is probably one too that kind of relates to that. Hey, that's
yeah, absolutely. So number 48 says, so this is under the section, the Settlement Agreement Parties and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And so just to give the background on that, so United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, we touched on this a bit. It's also known, like it's easier to say UNDRIP, so UNDRIP is something that's really important. Murray Sinclair referred to UNDRIP as sort of a roadmap for reconciliation. So what UNDRIP does is it sets out the minimum standards for the survival, dignity, and well-being of Indigenous peoples worldwide. So it was a collective effort of decades of work of Indigenous peoples around the world coming together and saying, look, we want a declaration on just the rights of Indigenous peoples. And people think, well, isn't it just human rights? And the issue is that Indigenous peoples' human rights, the minimum standards for their survival, dignity, and well-being were not being understood and recognized. And that's where UNDRIP comes from. And so now with UNDRIP as a roadmap for reconciliation, that's where it's really the foundation of what 48 is all about. So 48 reads, we call upon the church parties to the settlement agreement and all other faith groups and interfaith social justice groups in Canada who have not already done so to formally adopt and to comply with the principles, norms, and standards of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as a framework for reconciliation. This would include, but not be limited to, the following commitments. And so let's look at the first one first. It says, ensuring that their institutions, policies, programs, and practices comply with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And so this is this is a big one, and it could be challenging if you don't know what UNDRIP is. And so we have a link to UNDRIP in the description of this video. And again, it's worthwhile to read it. But I think it's really, if you look at it, it's the minimum standards for the survival, dignity, and well-being of a people group. And so as you read through it, even from a Christian lens, there shouldn't be anything in it that would be difficult or challenging. It's just recognizing that as you operate your church or your organization, your charity, or whatever it is, just look at these and ensure that you're following them. And I think that's something that's fair and easy to ask. Number 2, respecting Indigenous peoples' right to self-determination in spiritual matters, including the right to practice, develop, and teach their own spiritual and religious traditions, customs, and ceremonies, consistent with Article 12.1 of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And so we want to highlight here the right to self-determination in spiritual matters. So that's key. You know, in order for Christianity to truly be Christianity, it has to be a choice. You have to have that right to choose. And if you don't, you know, then it's not really Christianity.
Right. Yeah. And I think that is super crucial, right? Like that's the heart of it. And that's really maybe where, you know, not maybe, but that ties into the residential school problem that we're facing today is that right to choose was removed. And so there was this mistaken notion that you could somehow conform people or legislate people into Christian belief by removing from them the choice to Christian belief, which just flies in the face of legitimate Christian faith. You can't force feed Christianity. Here, do all of these practices, do all of these works, and somehow you will come out with the faith. It's backwards. So,
right, and we're seeing that just from some of the comments that are coming in as well. You know, just the fact that you know, this is a very important topic here. You know, just the right to choose, right, between the two. It's the reason why it's here in the first place is, yeah, again, just looking at the history of the fact that you know, it's unfortunately with many Indigenous peoples, their experiences have been, you know, with the residential school system and other policies that the Christian faith has been forced upon them, right? For us, within our experiences, and as we've opened up with our own testimony of how we've came to be introduced to Christianity, for us it was a choice, and it was a choice for our parents, our grandparents, our great grandparents, all the way through, and that's a story of how faith can, the Christian faith can be shown and shared in a way that is very powerful and meaningful, and in a way that is impactful to Indigenous communities, right? And so for us as Christians, we need to look at this and be able to respect the choice of each individual, including those who are Indigenous.
I mean, to me, this is so automatic to the Christian. I mean, Jesus, you go through his calling of disciples. Well, he sent as many away. He sent more away than he kept. Like, you know, the rich young ruler has to have the right to walk away sad. Like that's part of genuine discipleship. That is part of genuine following of Jesus. It's here we lay this out before you, but you can choose to say no, and that is just woven in. So yeah, I should think that shouldn't be, that should be something that as genuine followers of Jesus, we would look at this and say, yeah, we do need to respect that right. We respect you have the right to self-determination and so.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's the lens through which you look at it. You would look through it at the lens, and you see the the spiritual and religious traditions, customs, ceremonies, and that kind of a thing. And so you might look at it through the lens and just feel that discomfort, but look at it with like the full lens, as we talked about earlier, with the amount of research that's been done, in just the tons of volumes of work that's been done, then you realize like this choice hasn't been there. A simple thing like a choice, and that's what this is all about.
And it really that's a cascading effect. What we're seeing right now with the residential school, all of the pain, it really is simply, it was a simple but horrible, merging together of Christian language with political agendas, and removal of choice is what right now we're seeing the effects of that.